It was almost midnight when the knocking started. 3 frantic thuds that didn't belong in a place like this. Not outside the grand villa of Damien Rocco, the man whispered about as the most dangerous name in New York's underworld. He was in his study, half distracted by the glow of the fireplace and the quiet hum of storm outside, when he heard it again, harder this time. A desperate sound. A child's sound. He frowned. No one ever came to his door without calling first. And no one, absolutely no one, came to Damien Rocco's house by accident. He rose slowly, slipping his coat on as one of his guards entered the room. "Boss," the man said, looking uneasy. "There's a kid outside." Damien froze. "A kid?" "She's soaked to the bone, sir. Says she needs help." He walked toward the front doors, each step heavy against the marble floor. When they opened, rain spilled in like a curtain. There she stood. A little girl no older than 8, trembling, her hair plastered to her face. She clutched a small toy car in her hand, her lips purple from the cold. "Please," she whispered, looking up at him. "They took my little brother." Damien stared down at her, his expression unreadable. "Who took him?" "The men in the black car," she said between sobs. "They said Mama owed them money. They took him instead." Behind him, his men shifted uneasily. No one moved. No one dared. Damien had built his empire on fear and silence, not mercy. But as he looked at the little girl, something in his chest tightened. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Emma," she said. "Please, mister. They said if we tell the police, they'll hurt him." That single word, "please," broke through years of ice he'd built around himself. He exhaled slowly. "Get her inside," he said finally. "And get me the car." As the guards moved, the little girl reached out and grabbed his hand. "You'll really help me?" she whispered. He hesitated, then nodded once. "I will." In that single moment, Damien Rocco, the man who swore never to get involved in anyone's problems again, made a choice that would soon make the entire city whisper. His name for a very different reason, if you've ever seen someone risk everything to protect a child that wasn't theirs. Hit-like. Because what Damien did next would shake the streets and melt hearts across the world. The girl's clothes were dripping onto the marble floor as she stood near the fire, staring at Damien's men with wide, terrified eyes. One of the guards brought her a towel, another a mug of hot cocoa, but she didn't drink. She just kept holding that toy car, her thumb rubbing against its chipped paint, like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Damien sat across from her, his elbows on his knees, voice steady but quiet. "Tell me what happened, Emma. Start from the beginning." She swallowed hard. "Mama works at the diner on 5th Street. I help her sometimes. Today some men came while we were cleaning up. They yelled at her about money, said she borrowed from someone named Mr. Vico." Her voice cracked. "Mama said she was trying to pay, but they didn't listen. They pushed her down and took my little brother, Lucas. They said she'd get him back when she learned respect." Damien's jaw clenched. He knew that name. Vico Damaro, a low-level loan shark who'd once worked under his family years ago before betraying them. The man had disappeared after stealing from Rocco's own shipments. Now he was back, preying on the weak again. "Do you know where they took him?" Damien asked. Emma shook her head. "They drove away fast. Mama ran after them, but she fell. She told me to get help, so I ran. In the rain, alone?" She nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "You were the only one I could think of," Mama said once. She said a man named Rocco helped people before he stopped. That hit him harder than he expected. He looked at his right-hand man, Marco, standing silently by the door. Marco met his gaze and gave a small nod. "Boss, it's Vico. We've been tracking his crew for months. They've got a new base near the docks. Get the car," Damien said, standing abruptly. "And bring 2 men. No guns unless I say so." Emma looked up, startled. "You're going now?" "Yes." She ran toward him, clutching his coat. "Please, don't let them hurt Lucas. He's only 5. He's scared of the dark." Damien looked down at her, her tiny fingers gripping him with the kind of trust he didn't deserve. "No one's going to hurt your brother again," he said. When he turned away, Marco followed close behind. "You really want to go after Damaro yourself?" "I told you once," Damien said coldly, grabbing his coat. "No one touches a child in my city." Outside, thunder rolled through the night as the black sedan pulled away from the mansion. Inside, the little girl stood by the window, watching the taillights disappear into the storm. She didn't know it yet, but that drive would make Damien Rocco a legend, not for his power, but for his heart. The rain hadn't stopped. It came down in relentless sheets as Damien's car sped through the deserted streets toward the docks. The city slept while its shadows stayed wide awake. Inside the car, silence ruled. Heavy, expectant, the kind that carried violence in its lungs. Marco drove with one hand, the other resting near his holster. "Boss," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "You sure this is smart? If it's Vico's men, they'll have eyes everywhere." Damien stared out the window, the streetlights flashing across his sharp features. "I don't care how many eyes they have. A child's missing. That's all I need to know." Marco didn't argue further. He'd been with Damien long enough to recognize that tone, the one that meant there was no turning back. They pulled up near the shipping yard, the air thick with salt and oil. A few figures lingered by a warehouse entrance, smoking under a flickering light. Damien adjusted his gloves, stepping out into the rain. His presence alone turned heads, tall, composed, the kind of man who didn't need to shout to be feared. One of the thugs moved forward. "Private property. Get lost." Damien's voice was calm, too calm. "Tell Vico Damaro that Damien Rocco's here for the boy." The man froze, his cigarette dropping into a puddle. You're Rocco?" Damien took another step closer. "I'm not repeating myself." The guard's hand twitched toward his jacket, but Marco was faster. Gun drawn, muzzle pressed to the man's temple before he could blink. "Bad move," Marco murmured. Within seconds, the others scattered, shouting warnings into the warehouse. Damien walked straight through the open doors. Inside, the dim light flickered over crates, ropes, and the sharp scent of gasoline. Somewhere, a child was crying. He followed the sound until it led him to a small office in the back. Two men stood there, one pacing, one laughing, holding a toy car between his fingers. "You like this, kid? Maybe your mom will learn to pay next time." Damien's voice cut through the room like thunder. "Put the toy down." Both men turned. The one holding the car sneered. Well, didn't think the big man himself would crawl out here for some brat." Damien's eyes were cold as he stepped closer. "Let the boy go, and I'll pretend this never happened," the man smirked. "Or what, you'll kill us?" "No," Damien said softly. "I'll make you wish I had." And then everything happened at once. The gunshot, the scream, the crash of wood splintering. Marco's men flooded in, taking control in seconds. Damien moved straight to the child, huddled in a corner, shivering, a rope around his wrists. He knelt, cutting him free. "Hey," he said quietly. "You're safe now, Lucas." The boy blinked up at him, dazed. "You're not the police," Damien almost smiled. "No, but I keep promises." As they carried the child out into the storm, Marco glanced back at the unconscious men on the floor. "Boss, what should we do with them?" Damien didn't look back. "Remind them who owns this city. If you've ever believed that real strength is in protecting the weak, not hurting them, hit like right now." Because for the first time in years, the devil of New York had done something that made the world call him human. By the time they reached the mansion again, the storm had quieted into a steady drizzle. The headlights carved through the fog as Damien stepped out, his coat heavy with rain and blood that wasn't his. He carried Lucas in his arms, the boy fast asleep against his shoulder. Emma was waiting by the door, her small hands twisting in front of her chest. The moment she saw him, she froze. "Lucas?" she whispered. Damien gave a short nod, and that was all it took. She ran forward, bursting into tears as she wrapped her arms around her brother. He stirred, mumbling her name, and she laughed through the sobs. "You found him," she said, looking up at Damien, her eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. He should have just turned and walked away right then. That was how he'd survived all these years, never getting involved, never letting feelings slow him down. But something about the way she looked at him stopped him cold. Inside, Marco watched the scene quietly. "Boss," he murmured, "we can't keep them here. Damaro's crew won't take this quietly. I know, Damien said, his tone low. That's why we're moving them tonight. Moving them where? A safe house near Ridgewood. One of ours, Marco hesitated. That's not like you, Damien. He didn't answer immediately. He just kept watching the two children, Emma whispering to calm her brother as the rain tapped softly against the windows. People like us, Damien said finally. We can't fix much. But when life throws someone in front of you like this, you don't walk away. Marco didn't argue. He'd seen this side of his boss only once before, years ago, when Damien's younger sister had been caught in a crossfire meant for him. The day he lost her was the day he swore he'd never care again, until tonight. Later, when the children had fallen asleep in the guest room, Damien stood by the window with a glass of whiskey, the city lights flickering beyond the rain. Marco entered quietly. They're saying Vico's men are already looking for you. Word's spreading fast. Let them look, Damien replied. They'll find nothing but fear. Still, Marco added, you've made yourself a target again. Damien glanced at the sleeping kids reflected in the window. If they come for me, that's fine. But if they come for them, he set the glass down, his eyes turning sharp as glass. Then I'll remind every man in this city what happens when you touch what's mine. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, distant but promising. Damien Rocco had made a promise, one his enemies would soon wish he'd never kept. If you've ever made a promise you'd risk everything to protect, hit like and tell me. Would you have done what Damien did? Or walked away before it was too late? The rain stopped just before midnight, leaving the city drenched and silent. The mansion sat in the middle of that silence, lights low, shadows stretched long across the marble floors. Emma and Lucas were asleep in the guest room, tucked under thick blankets, the faint hum of the heater keeping the cold away. Damien hadn't moved from the study. He sat behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, cigarette burning slow between his fingers, eyes fixed on the security feed. Marco entered quietly. The outer patrol's done. All clear. Damien didn't look up. All clear never lasts, Marco frowned. You think they'll come tonight? I'd bet my life on it, Damien said, crushing the cigarette into the ashtray. Vico's too proud to hide after what I did. He'll want revenge, and he'll want witnesses. As if on cue, the security monitor flickered. A blur moved across one of the cameras, then another. Marco leaned in. There, north side fence. Before he could finish, the feed went black. Damien stood. Positions. No noise. Within seconds, the mansion came alive. Men moved like shadows through the halls. Guns drawn, but safeties on. The storm had left the ground slick, perfect for muffling footsteps. Outside, the intruders crept closer. 7 of them, dressed in black, faces hidden behind masks. They didn't know who they were walking into. One of them cut the power, plunging the house into darkness. But Damien preferred it that way. In the dark, he was a ghost. By the time the first man stepped through the side door, Damien was already behind him. A single blow to the throat. Silent, precise. The man crumpled. Another crept in through the kitchen window, only to be met with the barrel of Marco's gun. Lights out, friend. Upstairs, Emma woke to a faint sound, a muffled thud from the hallway. She sat up, heart pounding, clutching her brother. Lucas, stay quiet, she whispered. Stay under the bed. Damien heard her door creak from downstairs. The sound jolted something primal in him. He moved faster, every muscle ready to kill. The last man reached the top of the stairs, but before he could open the door, Damien grabbed him by the collar and slammed him into the wall. You came into my house, he hissed. Bad mistake. The man choked out a name. Vico says, but Damien didn't let him finish. Vico doesn't speak for this city anymore. When it was over, the mansion fell silent again. Marco came out from the hallway nodding. All down. No casualties. Damien wiped his hands, eyes still cold. Good. Dump them at the docks with a message. What message? Tell Vico, he said, turning toward the stairs. If he wants another war, he should remember who ended the last one. In the dim light, Emma peeked out from the room, trembling but safe. Damien looked at her and softened, just enough to say, You're safe now. If you've ever stood up for someone who couldn't defend themselves, like this story, because that's where real strength begins. The morning after the attack, sunlight poured weakly through the broken blinds. The smell of rain still clung to the air. Marco's men were clearing the mess. Bullet casings swept up, shattered glass replaced, blood wiped clean. But no one dared touch the staircase where Damien had stood last night, silent and unshaken, watching his enemies crawl away. That was sacred ground now, the line between mercy and warning. In the kitchen, Emma sat at the counter with Lucas, eating breakfast quietly. The boy clutched a new toy car Marco had given him, and though his face was pale, there was a faint smile. "Thank you," Emma said softly when Damien walked in. Her voice trembled like she still couldn't believe safety was something real. Damien nodded once, pouring himself a coffee. "You don't need to thank me." But Emma shook her head. "Yes, I do. You didn't have to help us. No one ever has before." He paused for a long moment. "I didn't do it for thanks," Lucas piped up between bites. "Mama says good people do things just because it's right." That one hit deeper than it should have. Damien looked down at the boy, small, innocent, untouched by the dirt of the world, and for a second, something inside him cracked. He turned away before anyone noticed. Later in the study, Marco entered with his usual frown. "Boss, we got word. Vico's been seen near the harbor. He's gathering men. He won't stop." "I know." Marco folded his arms. "Then we hit first?" Damien didn't answer immediately. He stared at the rain-drenched city skyline beyond the window. "No, not yet. Not yet?" Marco sounded stunned. "He sent men into your house. You nearly got those kids killed." Damien's voice was calm but cold. "If I start another war, innocent people die again. I've spilled enough blood to last 10 lifetimes. Marco sighed. "You're getting soft, boss." "Maybe," Damien said. "Or maybe I'm just tired of killing ghosts." Marco left without another word, but deep down, he knew. Damien Rocco wasn't soft. He was evolving. That night, Emma came to the study door. "You're not eating," she said. Damien looked up, caught off guard. "Not hungry." She stepped closer. "You saved us." "But who saves you?" For a second, his mask slipped. He wanted to tell her. No one. Not since his sister died. But he couldn't. "Go rest, Emma," he said quietly. She nodded, but as she turned away, she whispered, "You're not the monster they say you are." After she left, Damien sat back, staring at the doorway where she'd stood. Maybe she was wrong, or maybe she wasn't. But when he closed his eyes, he realized something terrifying. Mercy, once learned, always costs you more than violence ever could. If you've ever believed that kindness can change even the coldest hearts, like this video right now, and tell me in the comments, do you think mercy makes a man weak? Or stronger than anyone alive? That evening the mansion was quiet again. Too quiet. Damien sat alone in the study, staring at an old photograph tucked inside a drawer. It showed a younger version of himself, standing beside a woman with kind eyes and the same sharp cheekbones. His sister Lucia, the only person who ever believed he wasn't born to be a monster. Until the day she died because of his war, the sound of small footsteps pulled him back. He looked up to see Emma standing in the doorway again, her hair still damp from her shower, wearing one of the oversized shirts Maria, the housemaid, had given her. She hesitated before stepping inside. "You're always in this room," she said softly. "It's where I think," Damien replied. "About what?" He paused. "Things I can't change." Emma walked to the desk, her gaze falling on the photograph. "Is that your family?" Damien's jaw tightened, but he didn't hide it. "My sister. She used to tell me the same thing you said yesterday." "What thing?" "That I'm not the monster people think I am." Emma studied his face, her expression unreadable. "She was right, wasn't she?" He leaned back, sighing. "I don't know. I tried to protect her, but protection has a price. It always does." "She'd still be proud of you," Emma said quietly. "You saved me and Lucas. Maybe you're saving yourself too." Those words hit deeper than any bullet ever could. He looked at her. This girl who'd seen too much, lost too much, yet still spoke with hope. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. A knock on the door interrupted them. Marco stepped in, holding his phone. "Boss, you need to see this." Damien took the phone. The screen showed a video already spreading online, grainy footage from last night's attack. The caption read, "Mafia Boss protects 2 orphans. Is this the real Damien Rocco?" His name was trending. The man once feared by the city was now being called a hero. Damien's face darkened. "Who leaked this?" Marco shrugged. "No clue. But people are talking. Some are saying you've changed. Others think it's a setup." Damien placed the phone down. "I don't like attention." Emma tilted her head. "But maybe this is good attention." "Not for me," he said. "When people talk about me, people die." She frowned. "So you hide?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I survive." That night, as Emma tucked Lucas into bed, Damien stood by the window again, watching the city lights flicker. For the first time, he wondered what life could have been if Lucia were still alive, if kindness hadn't been punished so harshly. But deep inside, he knew something had changed. The girl's words had cracked the walls he'd built around himself, and once you let light in, darkness never feels the same again. The next morning started too calm, the kind of calm that made Damien suspicious. He was in the kitchen, pouring coffee, when Marco walked in holding a burner phone. "This came through the secure line 5 minutes ago," he said, placing it on the table. The screen flashed with one name, Vico Damaro. Damien's fingers tightened around the cup. "Put it on speaker." A low, mocking laugh came through the line. "Rocco, you always did love playing the savior." Damien's tone didn't waver. "You made a mistake taking that boy." "Ah," Vico said, his voice oily and smug. "You mean your new family? Cute. The devil of New York babysitting orphans. The city's talking, you know. Half of them think you've gone soft. The other half think you've gone mad." Damien's jaw flexed. "Say what you came to say." "You embarrassed me," Vico hissed. "You stormed my docks, took my men, made me a joke. So here's my deal. You give me the girl and I'll forget the rest. But if you don't..." His voice dropped, cold and deliberate. "I'll burn everything you care about, starting with your mansion." Marco cursed under his breath, but Damien stayed silent. Then he said softly, "You've already made your last threat, Vico." The line went dead. Marco exhaled sharply. "He's serious, boss. If he comes here again, it won't just be 7 men this time." "I know," Damien said, "which is why we won't wait for him." He looked toward the hallway where Emma's laughter echoed faintly. She was showing Lucas how to draw, their quiet giggles like something that didn't belong in his world. Something too fragile to last. Marco noticed his look. "You're thinking of moving them again?" Damien nodded. "Before nightfall. Somewhere even I can't find them. Boss, they trust you." "That's exactly why I have to do it," Damien said quietly. Hours later, he called Emma to the study. "Pack a small bag," he told her. "You and your brother are leaving tonight." Her eyes widened. "Leaving? Why? Did we do something wrong?" "No, I just can't protect you here anymore." She took a hesitant step forward. "You said we were safe." He hesitated. "You are. But safety doesn't last in my world." She looked at him for a long moment, her lower lip trembling. "Then why did you save us?" That question hit him like a blade. "Because I thought I could keep you safe," he said finally. "I was wrong." She didn't say another word. She just turned away, tears welling up, and left the room. When the door closed, Damien let out a slow breath and ran a hand through his hair. Marco, standing by the window, spoke softly. "You're not sending them away because you can't protect them. You're sending them away because you care." Damien's silence said it all. That night, long after everyone was asleep, Damien sat alone at his desk. The phone buzzed again, another message from Vico. This one wasn't a call. It was a photo, a van, parked just outside the mansion gates. The clock had just struck midnight when Damien heard the first sound, tires crunching over gravel. Then came the smell of gasoline. He moved to the window, his instincts snapping awake, and what he saw made his pulse turn to ice. A van, The same one from Vico's photo sat idling by the front gate. The engine was still running, headlights off. "Marco," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "Wake everyone, now." Within seconds, alarms echoed through the mansion. Guards poured into the courtyard, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Then a spark, small, almost harmless, flickered under the van. One heartbeat later, flames erupted. "Get down!" someone shouted as the explosion tore through the air. The blast shattered glass, fire lighting up the night sky. Damien shielded his face as debris rained down. The front gates were gone, just twisted metal and roaring flames. Marco came running. "They've started it, boss. We've got movement near the east wall." Damien's mind moved faster than his heartbeat. "Keep them back. Don't let them near the house." "What about the girl and the kid?" Marco asked. Damien's eyes hardened. "I'll handle them." He sprinted through the halls, smoke curling down from the ceiling. When he reached the guest room, Emma was already awake, clutching Lucas in her arms. "Damien," she cried. "What's happening?" "Get your brother." "Stay behind me," he ordered. His voice was calm, steady, the tone of a man who'd seen hell before and refused to fear it again. They moved fast through the back hallway, the floor trembling from distant gunfire. Outside, flames painted the sky orange. Damien's men exchanged fire with Vico's soldiers, black-clad figures moving like shadows through the smoke. Lucas whimpered, and Emma knelt, pressing a hand over his ears. "Don't look, baby. Just stay close." Damien aimed, fired, and dropped 2 men before they reached the garden gate. He turned to Marco, shouting over the chaos. "Get them to the cellar. Tunnel 3! Marco nodded and led Emma and Lucas down the narrow stone steps that led beneath the house. Damien followed, covering the entrance. "Go," he said. Emma stopped halfway down, tears streaking her smoke-stained face. "You're coming, right?" Damien hesitated. "I'll be right behind you." He wasn't lying. Not yet. When the last guard disappeared below, he turned back toward the fire. Through the smoke, he saw movement, a tall figure emerging from the blaze. Vico himself smiling like the devil. "Rocco," Vico shouted. "Hiding your new family underground? How noble of you." Damien raised his gun. "You shouldn't have come here." Vico laughed. "You took my men, my money, my docks. Now I'll take everything that keeps you human." The night erupted again with gunfire. Damien's world narrowed to instinct, to protect, to survive, to end this. Bullets tore through the marble walls. Sparks flew from the railings. And in that inferno, 2 men who had once ruled the same city faced each other for the last time. Down in the tunnel, Emma held Lucas close, listening to the chaos above. Each gunshot made her flinch. "He'll be okay," she whispered, though her voice broke halfway through. Smoke curled through the shattered doorway as Damien stepped out into the open courtyard, his boots crunching over broken glass. The night was alive with fire, flames licking the sky, the sharp scent of gunpowder hanging heavy. Across the yard, Vico stood near the fountain, his men fallen around him, but the grin on his face hadn't faded. "You've changed, Rocco," he taunted. "Used to be you'd finish a war before it started." Damien's voice was quiet but edged like a blade, "And you used to know when to stay dead." They circled each other, the firelight flickering across their faces. Damien fired first. Vico ducked, returning a shot that grazed Damien's arm. Pain seared, but he didn't flinch. He moved closer, firing again. The courtyard echoed with the clash of 2 lives built on violence finally breaking apart. Vico stumbled back against the fountain, bleeding, still laughing. "You think saving one little girl makes you a saint? You'll always be one of us." Damien's jaw clenched. "You're wrong. I used to think I couldn't escape who I was, but that was before I met her." He fired the last bullet. The sound was deafening. Vico collapsed against the fountain, the water running red. For a long moment, all Damien could hear was the crackle of burning wood and the slow beat of his own heart. He dropped his gun and turned toward the house. The walls were collapsing, the heat unbearable. He sprinted through the smoke, coughing, his body screaming from exhaustion. He reached the cellar door and shouted, "Marco! Emma!" Marco emerged from the tunnel, his face blackened with soot. "Boss, you're hurt?" "I'm fine," Damien said. "Get them out, now." Emma appeared next, holding Lucas close, tears streaking her face. When she saw him, she froze. "Damien." He smiled faintly despite the blood running down his arm. "Told you I'd be right behind you." The ceiling groaned, splitting apart. Marco grabbed Lucas, shouting, "We need to move, now!" They ran through the narrow tunnel, emerging into the woods behind the mansion. The roar of the fire faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the trees. Damien fell to his knees, breathing hard. The orange glow of his burning empire lit the sky behind him. Emma knelt beside him, pressing a trembling hand to his arm. "You saved us," she whispered. Damien looked at her, the girl who had run to him out of nowhere and changed everything he believed about himself. "No," he said softly. "You saved me." She shook her head, tears falling. "You can start over now. You don't have to be him anymore." He stared into the flames one last time. Maybe I already stopped being him the moment I chose to protect instead of destroy. For the first time, Damien Rocco, the man they once called the devil, felt peace. Not victory, not vengeance, just peace. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the ruins of the Rocco estate in pale gold. Smoke still rose from the ashes, curling lazily into the morning air. The once grand mansion now stood as a skeleton of its former self, charred beams, cracked marble, and a silence that felt heavier than any gunfire. Damien stood at the edge of the wreckage, his arm bandaged, his face bruised but steady. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the faint scent of burnt wood and wet soil. Behind him, Emma and Lucas stood quietly, their eyes wide as they looked at what had once been a fortress of power. "Is it all gone?" Lucas asked softly. Damien glanced back at him, then nodded. "Yeah, everything that needed to be." Marco approached from behind, his steps slow but sure. "We counted 12 bodies, none of them ours. The cops are calling it a gas leak." Damien almost smiled. Let them believe that. He turned to Emma. She was still shivering slightly, her hair tangled, her clothes streaked with soot. Yet in her eyes there was something different. Strength, maybe, or defiance. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. "I wasn't going to," she replied, her voice steady but soft. "But you didn't have to do what you did." He looked at her, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Didn't I?" For a moment neither spoke. The air between them carried the weight of everything that had happened. The fire, the fear, the choices that couldn't be undone. Lucas tugged Emma's hand. "Can we go home now?" She glanced down, her eyes clouding. "We don't have one anymore, sweetheart." Before Damien could speak, Marco cleared his throat. "Boss, there's a place by the river. Safe house we used a few years back. Quiet, clean, off-grid. They could stay there." Emma's eyes darted toward Damien. "They?" He hesitated. "You and Lucas. Until you decide what's next." She frowned. "And what about you?" Damien looked back at the smoldering remains of his empire. "I'm still deciding that." They rode in silence for hours. When they reached the small cottage by the river, Emma stepped out first, her shoes crunching on gravel. The air smelled of pine and rain, untouched, peaceful. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Damien stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "It's safe," he said simply. "That's what matters." Emma turned to him, her eyes searching his. "You could stay, just for a while." He shook his head slowly. "Men like me don't stay, Emma. We just make sure the people who deserve peace get to keep it." As he started to walk back toward the car, Lucas ran forward and hugged his leg. "Thank you, mister," he said, voice muffled. Damien froze. Then after a moment, he placed a hand on the boy's head. "Be good for your sister." He turned and walked away, his figure fading into the misty morning light. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the ruins of the Rocco estate in pale gold. Smoke still rose from the ashes, curling lazily into the morning air. The once grand mansion now stood as a skeleton of its former self, charred beams, cracked marble, and a silence that felt heavier than any gunfire. Damien stood at the edge of the wreckage, His arm bandaged, his face bruised but steady. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the faint scent of burnt wood and wet soil. Behind him, Emma and Lucas stood quietly, their eyes wide as they looked at what had once been a fortress of power. "Is it all gone?" Lucas asked softly. Damien glanced back at him, then nodded. "Yeah, everything that needed to be." Marco approached from behind, his steps slow but sure. "We counted 12 bodies. None of them ours. The cops are calling it a gas leak." Damien almost smiled. Let them believe that. He turned to Emma. She was still shivering slightly, her hair tangled, her clothes streaked with soot. Yet in her eyes there was something different. Strength, maybe, or defiance. "You don't have to thank me," he said quietly. "I wasn't going to," she replied, her voice steady but soft. "But you didn't have to do what you did." He looked at her, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Didn't I?" For a moment neither spoke. The air between them carried the weight of everything that had happened. The fire, the fear, the choices that couldn't be undone. Lucas tugged Emma's hand. "Can we go home now?" She glanced down, her eyes clouding. "We don't have one anymore, sweetheart." Before Damien could speak, Marco cleared his throat. "Boss, there's a place by the river. Safe house we used a few years back. Quiet, clean, off-grid. They could stay there." Emma's eyes darted toward Damien. "They?" He hesitated. "You and Lucas. Until you decide what's next." She frowned. "And what about you?" Damien looked back at the smoldering remains of his empire. "I'm still deciding that." They rode in silence for hours. When they reached the small cottage by the river, Emma stepped out first, her shoes crunching on gravel. The air smelled of pine and rain, untouched, peaceful. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Damien stood beside her, his hands in his pockets. "It's safe," he said simply. "That's what matters." Emma turned to him, her eyes searching his. "You could stay, you know, just for a while." He shook his head slowly. "Men like me don't stay, Emma. We just make sure the people who deserve peace get to keep it." As he started to walk back toward the car, Lucas ran forward and hugged his leg. "Thank you, mister," he said, voice muffled. Damien froze. Then after a moment, he placed a hand on the boy's head. "Be good for your sister." He turned and walked away, his figure fading into the misty morning light. Days passed quietly by the river. The world outside seemed to have forgotten Emma and Lucas, and for once, that was a blessing. The mornings were filled with soft light and the sound of birds, the kind of peace neither of them had known in years. But at night, when the wind whistled through the trees, Emma sometimes caught herself glancing at the door, half expecting to see Damien's shadow standing there. He never came. Still, every morning, fresh groceries appeared on the porch. Bread, milk, sometimes small toys for Lucas. No footprints. No sound, just quiet protection that never announced itself. One evening, Emma found an envelope slipped under the door. Her heart skipped when she saw the neat, heavy handwriting. Damien's. She sat by the window and unfolded it carefully. "Emma, you once asked me why I saved you. I told you I thought I could keep you safe. The truth is, I wasn't saving you. I was saving the part of me that still remembered what mercy felt like. I built an empire that made men kneel, but you made me stop running. I never had a family. Never thought I could until a girl with fire in her eyes stood between me and my own darkness. Keep your brother close. Teach him that being strong doesn't mean being cold. And if he ever asks what kind of man Damien Rocco was, tell him I finally learned that power isn't fear. It's the courage to protect someone without expecting anything back. You and Lucas reminded me of that. That's something no fire can burn away." By the time she finished reading, her vision blurred with tears. She folded the letter and pressed it to her chest, her breath shaky. "He's gone," she whispered to herself. But he didn't really leave. Outside, Lucas was chasing fireflies near the water. He looked up and saw his sister's face in the window. "Mama, are you okay?" She smiled weakly. "Yeah, baby, I think we're finally safe." That night, She placed Damien's letter inside a small wooden box, the same one where she kept her mother's wedding ring and Lucas's first drawing. It wasn't just a note. It was proof that monsters could learn to love, and that even the darkest men could choose the light. Far across the city, in a dim warehouse now serving as his new base, Damien stood alone. The scars on his hands had healed, but the ache in his chest hadn't. He watched the river through a cracked window, knowing somewhere beyond it, they were alive. Marco stepped beside him quietly. "You sure you don't want to go back?" Damien shook his head. "They don't need me to come back. They just need me to keep the world from finding them again." The river had a way of remembering things. Its current carried secrets, washed away pain, and whispered promises only those who'd lost something could hear. Emma often sat by its edge after Lucas went to sleep, listening to the water and wondering if Damien ever stood on the other side. Some nights, she could swear she felt him near. Like the wind paused for a heartbeat before brushing her hair, or the forest stilled when she whispered his name. It wasn't love in the way fairy tales told it. It was something quieter, something heavier, gratitude mixed with ache. One morning, Emma noticed something new by the old fence post, a folded piece of cloth tied with string. Inside was a small silver bracelet engraved with a single word: strength. Her breath caught. He'd been here. Not far away, not gone, just watching from the shadows, keeping his promise. Lucas came running, holding a wildflower in his hand. "Look what I found," he said, smiling. "Can we give it to the man who helped us?" Emma crouched beside him, brushing his hair back. "Maybe one day, baby. But for now, we can thank him by being happy. That's what he wanted." She didn't tell Lucas that every night she left the porch light on, a quiet signal in the dark, in case Damien ever needed to find his way back. Far across the city, Damien was fighting his own silence. Every instinct he'd built his life on, control, power, fear, felt useless now. The men who once knelt before him were gone, scattered to other syndicates. The only empire left to rule was the one inside his chest, and it was breaking apart slowly, piece by piece. Marco poured him a drink one night, breaking the quiet. "You ever gonna tell her goodbye properly?" Damien stared at the glass before setting it down untouched. "Goodbye isn't for people who still hope." Marco smirked faintly. "You think she's waiting?" Damien looked toward the city lights. "No, I think she's living. That's enough." He didn't know that at that very moment, Emma sat by the window of the cottage, tracing the bracelet with her thumb. She didn't cry anymore. Instead, she smiled. A small, knowing smile that only people who've survived storms can wear. "Wherever you are," she whispered. "Thank you. Sometimes the most powerful love story isn't the one where people end up together. It's the one where they both find peace apart." It was late autumn, when the letter arrived at Damien's new safe house. No one knew the address except Marco and a handful of trusted men. The envelope was small, cream-colored, and sealed with a faded blue sticker of a tiny flower. Childish, almost. But the handwriting stopped him cold. It was Emma's. He held it for a long time before opening it, fingers tracing her neat loops and careful lines. The smell of faint lavender still clung to the paper. When he finally unfolded it, his throat tightened. "Damien, you told me once that people like you don't stay. But maybe you were wrong. You did stay, just not here. Every loaf of bread on the porch, every toy Lucas found, every shadow I saw outside the window that didn't scare me. That was you. You stayed in every quiet act of protection, and I need you to know it mattered. Lucas asks about you sometimes. He doesn't remember everything, but he remembers that you came for us when no one else did. I tell him you were a friend who kept his promises. We're building something small here. A garden, a home, a life that doesn't feel borrowed anymore. You gave us that. You gave me strength I didn't know I had. So if you ever doubt the kind of man you became, remember this. You didn't destroy. You saved. You didn't take. You gave. That's the legacy you left behind, Damien. And it's more powerful than anything money or fear could ever buy." Emma, for the first time in years, Damien couldn't hold back the tears. He folded the letter and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, right where his heart had once felt hollow. Boss, Marco said softly from the doorway. You okay? Damien exhaled slowly, his voice quieter than usual. No, but I will be. That night, he drove alone to the river, the same one that separated their worlds. He stood there under the silver moonlight, the wind biting cold against his skin. From across the water, a faint light flickered, the porch lamp Emma still left on. He smiled, one of those rare smiles that reached his eyes. You kept the light on, huh? He murmured. Guess I'll keep my promise, too. The next morning, Marco found him sitting by the water, the letter folded neatly beside him, a small flower tucked between the pages. Damien wasn't a man who prayed often, but in that stillness, his silence felt like one. Sometimes healing doesn't come from forgiveness. It comes from being remembered, kindly by someone who had every reason to hate you. It was late autumn, when the letter arrived at Damien's new safe house. No one knew the address except Marco and a handful of trusted men. The envelope was small, cream-colored, and sealed with a faded blue sticker of a tiny flower. Childish, almost. But the handwriting stopped him cold. It was Emma's. He held it for a long time before opening it, fingers tracing her neat loops and careful lines. The smell of faint lavender still clung to the paper. When he finally unfolded it, his throat tightened. Damien, you told me once that people like you don't stay. But maybe you were wrong. You did stay, just not here. Every loaf of bread on the porch, every toy Lucas found, every shadow I saw outside the window that didn't scare me. That was you. You stayed in every quiet act of protection, and I need you to know it mattered. Lucas asks about you sometimes. He doesn't remember everything, but he remembers that you came for us when no one else did. I tell him you were a friend who kept his promises. We're building something small here. A garden, a home, a life that doesn't feel borrowed anymore. You gave us that. You gave me strength I didn't know I had. So if you ever doubt the kind of man you became, remember this. You didn't destroy. You saved. You didn't take. You gave. That's the legacy you left behind, Damien. And it's more powerful than anything money or fear could ever buy. Emma, for the first time in years, Damien couldn't hold back the tears. He folded the letter and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, right where his heart had once felt hollow. Boss, Marco said softly from the doorway. You okay? Damien exhaled slowly, his voice quieter than usual. No, but I will be. That night, he drove alone to the river, the same one that separated their worlds. He stood there under the silver moonlight, the wind biting cold against his skin. From across the water, a faint light flickered, the porch lamp Emma still left on. He smiled, one of those rare smiles that reached his eyes. You kept the light on, huh? He murmured. Guess I'll keep my promise, too. The next morning, Marco found him sitting by the water, the letter folded neatly beside him, a small flower tucked between the pages. Damien wasn't a man who prayed often, but in that stillness, his silence felt like one. Sometimes healing doesn't come from forgiveness. It comes from being remembered kindly by someone who had every reason to hate you. Winter came softly that year. Snow blanketed the city, muffling the chaos that once echoed through Damien Rocco's world. The streets that used to tremble at his name now slept under a hush of peace he'd helped create, silently, from the shadows. Emma and Lucas stood outside their cottage one morning, the world around them pure white. Lucas giggled as he tried to catch snowflakes on his tongue. Mama, he said, do you think Mr. Damien can see the snow too? Emma smiled, adjusting his scarf. I think he can, sweetheart. And maybe he's smiling too. A few days later, a small package arrived on their porch, wrapped in brown paper. No return name, just a single embossed letter D on the corner. Inside, Emma found two things. A small wooden snow globe with a river scene carved inside it, and a note in that familiar handwriting, for Lucas, so he'll always have a piece of winter magic. For Emma, thank you for showing me what mercy feels like. She held the snow globe in her palm, watching the tiny flakes swirl over the carved figures of a man and a woman standing by a river. For a long moment she couldn't breathe. Then she whispered, Goodbye, Damien. Miles away, Damien stood on the balcony of a secluded villa, looking out over the same river, its frozen surface reflecting the pale morning light. He wore his usual black coat, but something in his posture had changed. The man who once commanded fear now carried peace like armor. Marco joined him, silent as ever. After a long pause, he said, "It's done, isn't it?" Damien nodded. "Yeah, for the first time in my life, it really is." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out Emma's last letter, and read it once more before folding it carefully and tucking it back close to his heart. "She'll be okay," Marco said quietly. "I know," Damien replied. "That's why I can finally walk away." He turned toward the horizon, where dawn broke in soft gold light. It wasn't the kind of ending where people reunite. It was the kind where they both learn to live again. The kind where silence becomes its own form of love. As the sun rose higher, Damien whispered to no one in particular, "Stay safe, Emma." And across the river, Emma, standing by her window, whispered, "Be free, Damien, two souls, bound by pain and gratitude, released each other under the same sky. No promises, no regrets. Just peace." If this ending touched your heart, tap like, share it, and tell me in the comments, do you believe some goodbyes are meant to last forever? Or do they find their way back when we least expect it?